Good evening. Great to see everybody here tonight. Let's hope and pray that lightning does not strike the same place twice so that we can make it all the way through our service this evening. The impetus for tonight's lesson actually comes from the recent young men's class where we are going through and answering questions, and one of those questions had to deal with how can we know that the Bible is right? And then the follow-up to that is how do we know that we are right? And I want to step back to the first part of that question because we were able to just briefly address it in the young men's class, and I want to expand that idea, but in expanding it, we are going to focus in on one particular aspect of the Bible, of Scripture, and that is, are the Gospels reliable? In other words, is the story about Jesus something that we can trust? Or is this something that men came up with or that's been corrupted through the years that we can't even know the real Jesus? You turn on the History Channel for any amount of time and they're going to say, well, we don't even really know if Jesus existed. And what we find is that when we actually carefully look at the Gospels, they bear the marks of reliable, trustworthy history. And unlike most religions in the world, we base our faith on that which is revealed, that which is evidence, hard evidence, that then allows us to trust in Jesus, to trust in God. And I want to provide some reasons why we can know that when we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are accurately telling us the story about Jesus so that we can entrust ourselves to Him and know that our hope is not in vain. We have a lot of material to get through, and so I'm going to try to be conscious of the time. And so I'd invite you to follow along with me in your notes and in the Bible readings as we try to determine the answer to this question. The first thing I want us to note together is that the Gospels claim to be records of eyewitnesses. That should give us a piece of evidence that says, if these are indeed what they claim to be, we can trust them. Because these are first-hand accounts. It's not that my grandfather was told by his grandfather who was told by his grandfather that this Jesus lived over here in Palestine. No, these were records given to us by eyewitnesses. And look at these claims. First in John chapter 19 and verse number 35. John chapter 19 and verse number 35. The Apostle John writes, "And he who has seen has borne witness, and his witness is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you may also believe." Now, notice, at this point, I'm not telling you to just believe it because the Bible says it, but this is the claim that is being made. John is saying, I have seen it, and you can trust me. Now, he's going to give reasons why you can trust him throughout the Gospels, but he says, I saw it. This is not secondhand knowledge. Look at chapter 21 and verse number 24. John chapter 21 and verse number 24 says, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his witness is true." Now, that plural we has raised some questions in some people's mind. Is this John using we? Well, it seems like you have we versus he, and so it seems like those people who are helping John as he is finishing up this gospel, kind of like Paul would sometimes have people write down the letters for him, they are also giving testimony that what John said is accurate, that he saw it, and we bear witness that he is true. So you have secondary evidence of people, inspired people, who are saying John saw what he claimed he saw. Now, if we step aside from the Gospels for just a moment, let's look at what John says in 1 John chapter 1. 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And here in this text, as he is writing to Christians, the Gospel of John may have had a broader audience, Christians and non-Christians, so that non-Christians could come to believe in Jesus. We'll talk about that text in just a moment. 1 John seems to be written exclusively to Christians, and yet it's a warning. It's trying to tell them, this is why you need to pay attention to what I say, and not to what these false teachers of chapter 2 are saying. He says in 1 John chapter 1, "What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have beheld and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. And the life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. What we have seen and heard we proclaim to you also, so that you may have fellowship with us. And indeed our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son Jesus Christ. And these things we are writing so that our joy may be made complete." Notice the significance that he places on these people who are reading, believing the message of John. He says, this is the only way you can have fellowship with the Father. You can't have fellowship with God unless you accept our testimony about Jesus Christ. Now, are there reasons to believe that John is telling the truth? We're going to get to those reasons in just a moment. But he is saying, I saw it, and if you don't believe it, you can't be in fellowship with God. Because this good news is totally based on what has been revealed by these inspired eyewitnesses. Now, look at Luke chapter 1. I want to put this in just slight contrast to what we've seen in the Gospel of John and the Epistle of John. Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Notice that Luke was not an eyewitness. Though he was inspired, he collected the testimony of eyewitnesses, and he compiled that together into this single gospel. He says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, handed them down to us, it seemed fitting to me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in orderly sequence, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty about the things you have been taught. Luke is saying, you don't just believe it because someone told you so. You look at the evidence that's been given. And he says, I want you to know with certainty. And I have examined everything closely. And I received it from those who were eyewitnesses. Now, at this point, we're not even dealing with the concept of inspiration. And I believe that God had his hand in this the whole time, that the very words that Luke wrote down were the words that he wanted written. But by Luke's own testimony, he's saying, this is trustworthy because I received it from people who actually saw Jesus. And he wants Theophilus to know with certainty the things that he has come to believe. Now, here are some reasons why I think we can believe these witnesses. So the scriptures claim to be by eyewitnesses, and they bear the marks of being by eyewitnesses. But what is it about those eyewitnesses that makes them trustworthy? How do we know they weren't liars? How do we know they weren't just in it for the fame or for the money? Well, here are 4 reasons that I think are very important. Number 1, they were contemporary. Number 2, they were converted. Number 3, they were persecuted. And number 4, they were invested. Let me quickly touch on what each of those means as we relate to this point. Number 1, they were actually there at the time. It's one thing to claim to be an eyewitness, but be writing 200 years later. What we have here are people who actually wrote in the first century, and we know that from the point that we're going to look at in our next major point. They wrote in the first century, they saw Jesus, and they give us details that only eyewitnesses could have known. They were there. They were contemporary. Number 2, they were converted. You might think, well, why is this a point of issue? Why should we believe these people? Because they were converted to Christianity. It's because that shows us that what they saw in Jesus was not some crazy person, not some liar, but someone who authenticated his claims, and they were willing to give their life to him because of what he was doing. I think 2 of the most significant eyewitnesses of Jesus that this conversion point is very important are James and Paul. When you look at James, James was the half-brother of Jesus. And if he could have known that his brother was a false teacher, a liar, made it all up, it would have been James. And yet, even though in his ministry he thinks Jesus, along with the other family members of Jesus, think he's crazy, and they don't want the shame of this man who has no official education now proclaiming these great teachings, they come to take him away. Right after the resurrection of Jesus, James gives his life to his brother. And no longer claims, according to the book of James, he doesn't say, I'm the half-brother of Jesus to give legitimacy to his claims. He says, I am a servant of Jesus. He became a slave to his brother. Why? Because he saw Jesus alive from the dead. He was an eyewitness. Paul, who at the beginning was against Christianity and was trying to kill Christians, suddenly changes and becomes a Christian. Why would that be? Well, he says it's because he saw a vision of the resurrected Lord. He was an eyewitness of Jesus in heaven, and it changed his life, and he became a Christian. Now, as we're going to see in the next few points, if this was all just a made-up story, these eyewitnesses really didn't see what they thought they saw, or they were making the whole thing up, we might say, well, they were just deluded, not converted. But what we see is that their conversion was authentic based on what they actually saw and what they were willing to give. That brings us to our third point, is that they were persecuted for their eyewitness testimony. They were willing to die. Now, some people might say, well, Muslims are willing to die for what they believe to be true, radical Muslims. What we find is that though people will die for what they believe to be true, hardly anyone, if anyone, will die for what they know to be false. And these people were in a position to know whether or not Jesus was the Messiah, whether or not he was raised from the dead. And yet they were willing to die. They didn't get earthly rewards out of all this. Most of them were poor and needed the support of others just to have daily necessities. And yet they were willing to go to the cross. They were willing to go to the stake. They were willing to go to the arena. Why? Because they believed in the one that they saw raised from the dead. So they were persecuted. That at least should give them a hearing before we dismiss them. And then finally, they were invested. I'm trying to reverse a point that is sometimes made, that you can't trust people who are invested in something as trustworthy, because they're going to spin the facts to fit what they want it to say. But that's not always true. You think about the history of the Holocaust. Some of our most reliable records, and the reason we have so many records, is because there were Jews who wrote down this history. You think Jews are not invested in the history of the Holocaust? You don't think they are emotionally bound up in it? They absolutely are, yet we trust their history because as we look at it and we test it and we compare it, we see that these people are actually trying to keep the history alive. They're trying to tell us the story. I think the same is true of Christians and Jesus. They were invested in this story, and so they revealed this story to people who needed to hear this story. So they were in the right time period. They gave themselves completely to Jesus. They were willing to die for Jesus, and they were completely invested, even emotionally invested in this story. That makes them good eyewitnesses of the things that they claimed to see. Now that brings us to our second major point, is that the Gospels intend to preserve accurate history of the ministry of Jesus. Someone might say, okay, they're eyewitnesses, but maybe they're just kind of embellishing the facts, or maybe the church kind of fit things together the way they wanted, and the story kind of became a legend as you move through time. What we find is that those original writers, those eyewitnesses, were not just trying to make up a story with the seed of truth. They were trying to give us an accurate history of the things that they saw. We already saw that with Luke. In fact, one, I can't remember the source, but one has said that Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 is such beautiful Greek and such actually intelligent and almost academic Greek that he says it is not one whit less in its beauty, I think he says, one whit less than some of the great historians, the great Greek writers of the classical period. So Luke is an educated person, and this is a person who is saying, I know what I'm talking about, I've gathered all the testimony, and I'm giving it to you in an orderly fashion. He wanted to write down a history so that they could be sure of what they had believed. Now, not a gospel, but Peter gives his eyewitness testimony and why it is so important that he is trying to give us not a myth, not a legend, but actual history in 2 Peter chapter 1. Let's turn there and read that one. 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. Just for a little bit of context, notice in the previous verse that he's saying, I am about to die very soon. That probably places us sometime in the 60s, just before Peter is put to death, Tradition says that he was put to death by the Romans on a cross, and he petitioned to be hanged upside down because he did not think himself worthy to be killed in the same manner as his Lord. But he says, because of this, he says, "For we did not make known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, following cleverly devised myths, but being eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when we received honor and glory from God the Father, such an utterance of this, as this was made to him by the majestic glory, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased.' And we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain." He says, I'm trying to tell you what I actually saw. His intent is to give you reliable history of the Mount of Transfiguration. He's saying, we're not following cleverly devised myths. These are not stories that just developed over time and we're just kind of handing them on to you. He says, we saw it and we're writing it down so that you can know with accuracy what happened in the ministry of Jesus. And I think we can include with that, if we take 1 and 2 Peter together, that he wants us to know about the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, the exaltation of Jesus, so that we can give our lives totally to him. Now, do the Gospels meet historical tests? Are they reliable? Can we trust them? Well, I think there are three very important reasons why we can say this is history. Yes, these people are invested. Yes, it is a theological history of sorts. Yes, there is religion, there is faith associated with this, but it is a historical account. Why? Number one, because of early testimony. Number two, because of divergent details. And number three, because of embarrassing facts. We basically already talked about the first point, but I would just add to that what is written was not centuries after the fact. In fact, we have very good reason for believing this was indeed in the first century and earlier in the first century, within 20 or 30 years, that the Gospels, at least most of the Gospels, would have been written from the time of the death of Jesus Christ. In fact, Paul would even say in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the essential elements of the good news is the death, burial, resurrection, and appearance of Jesus. And he's writing within 20 or so years of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And he's saying, this is what we already believe. This is what we've been handing down. This is the gospel. That's the very things that the gospel accounts, the biographies of Jesus, are focusing on. In fact, you look at the gospels, yes, there is focus on the ministry, but over half of those books are talking about the trial, the death, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus. That is the focal point of the gospels. That was what was handed down very early on. And so we know that in the first century, these things were being spoken by inspiration, and they were also being written down. I'll get to a point in just a moment to give you actual data, but we even have a copy of the Gospel of John, John chapter 18, that dates probably within 30 to 50 years of the actual writing of the Gospel of John, who claimed to be an eyewitness. In fact, it's interesting that in the 1800s, there were liberal German theologians who had developed an entire system to say that basically you have a development of Christianity, development of the story of Christianity, and you had kind of a converging of things, and that it wasn't until well into the second century, near the third century, that you actually have the Gospel of John being written. So they're basically saying the Gospel of John was not written in the first century. And then what we find is just after that whole school had developed that idea, then you find a manuscript that dates to the early second century. So you have a copy that pushes the writing of the Gospel of John well into the first century and completely demolishes a liberal school just by the finding of one single piece of parchment. And so we have here this picture of very early testimony. And when you read the Gospels, they are not only historical because they fit in that time period, but they are also historical because there's no sign of collusion. It's not that you just have the disciples sitting together and say, okay, what's the story going to say next? And they all just, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all sat down and started kind of fitting it all together and saying, this is what we're going to say here, and this is what we're going to say here, and this is what we're going to say here. No, you have them telling different details. So these are independent documents. Now, there may have been some meeting together of Matthew may have known about Mark, or Luke may have known about Mark, or depending on how you date all that, there could have been some understanding, but they weren't all sitting together. These are independent gospels. And we know that they are because they emphasize different details. Now, this doesn't mean that there are contradictions, but it shows that they're not just pounding out the story together over the dinner table. In Mark chapter 16 and chapter 10 and verse 46, you find that Jesus heals Bartimaeus. But then you compare that to Matthew chapter 9 and verse 27, and it's 2 men that are healed of blindness. Did Mark make a mistake? Did Matthew add something that wasn't there? No, it's just Mark is giving us the particular person and a specific name that they probably would have been aware of, and so he focuses on the one man. Matthew wants to give additional details. There were actually 2 men that were healed. Or in Mark chapter 16 and verse number 5, and compared with John chapter 20 and verse 12, were there 2 angels or was there 1 angel? Well, one focuses on one focuses on the other. They're not saying there wasn't 2 angels or that there was, so it's not contrasting, but they're giving different details, and that actually helps the case for believing that these are independent historical documents that are giving us details about the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. Related to that, you also have embarrassing facts. If you're making up a story so that you can get all the fame, all the money, then you're probably not going to tell things about yourself that are embarrassing. And yet what we find is that these eyewitnesses talk about their faithlessness throughout the ministry of Jesus. Peter, if he is part of the writing of the Gospel of Mark, is telling about his biggest failures in his discipleship. If you're just making up a story and you want everyone to follow you, why do you include those details? Well, maybe because you're actually trying to say what actually happened, and you're not just making up a story. And so these actually pass various details telling us this is very early eyewitness testimony, and they are writing history for us to understand. It is early, there are divergent details, and there are embarrassing facts. But someone might then raise the question, okay, let's just suppose there actually were eyewitnesses who wrote down the story of Jesus. And let's just suppose that they were actually trying to write down an accurate history of. How do we know that we have what they actually wrote? And that brings us to our third question. Have the Gospels been reliably preserved for us? And I want to say that it is an overwhelming yes. Christians copied the Gospels early and very well. I did a little bit of digging on some of the numbers of the copies that we have before AD 1000. And there are 659 copies of the New Testament in part or in whole before AD 1000. 356, that's 54% of those copies, are of the Gospels. That shows us that the early Christians were very concerned about copying the Gospels. That's not that they were unconcerned about Paul's letters or the general letters or Revelation, but we do see that there's an emphasis. They copied a lot of copies of the Gospels. And so that tells us that we have almost an embarrassment of riches here, that we can start comparing all these copies of the Gospels and seeing what was actually written. What we find is while there are minor differences, there are no major differences. There are no major doctrinal differences. There are not things that are going to completely revolutionize our idea of Jesus. You know, the National Geographic about, 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, made a big publication of the Gospel of Judas and said, this is going to completely revolutionize the way you look at Jesus. That Judas was actually the good guy, Judas was actually the good guy, and all the other disciples were kind of holding Jesus back from what he intended to do. What you find is that's a second century gospel that does not reveal any historical fact. Just read it for yourself and you'll see just how off the wall it is. It does not reveal what these people are trying to do with it. When you start reading the Gospels, you're finding there are very early copies, pushing us all the way into the first century with the originals. Furthermore, as I already mentioned, P52, that stands for Papyrus 52, is dated somewhere between AD 100 and 200. Sometimes you'll hear the number 120 or 130 AD. I think we need to give it a little bit broader range. It was sometime in the 2nd century, but that pushes this all the way back. So Christians were not just taking a little story and then embellishing and copying and adding and adding and adding and adding. We have so many copies that we can say, this is what the original said. With 99% certainty, we can say, these are what the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually said. Whether or not you want to agree with what they said is up to you. But this is what they said. And so you have eyewitnesses who are trying to reveal accurate history, and we know that they have been copied very well, so that we have very good reason for accepting that this is reliable historical documents. But just to, I don't like using the phrase play the devil's advocate, but just to take away another argument that is sometimes made, I want to suggest that it's not just the Gospels that show us that this history about Jesus actually happened and that they are revealing something reliable. I want to show that even non-biblical historical documents are verifying the very stories that the Gospels are telling us, and along with that, archaeological data as well. The key elements that are recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that is the big things about Jesus, specifically that he actually lived. He's not just a made-up figure. He actually lived. He died. He was believed by his disciples to be raised from the dead and believed by them to be exalted to heaven, is also witnessed in non-biblical documents. For instance, Josephus, Tacitus, and Pliny, or Pliny, however you want to pronounce his name. Notice that these are historical documents that are within the 1st century or just past the 1st century, very early 2nd century, and they're already telling us some of the very things, the history that is in the Gospels. So let's take a look at just a few quotes very quickly. Josephus says in his book, Antiquities, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man," and I'm alighting a couple of things that are believed to be Christian additions, so I'm just taking the very bare minimum, and let's see how it stacks up against history. "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him." You might say, well, what does this do for us? Number one, it says that in the 1st century, Josephus says Jesus actually lived. So we can't say that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John just made up this Jesus figure. There is someone who is not a Christian saying Jesus actually lived. And he was a teacher. Notice he's called a wise man. So he was someone who went about teaching. Isn't that what the Gospels tell us? Jesus lived and he went about teaching. Furthermore, he was a miracle worker. And so he did surprising feats. Now, everyone acknowledged this according to the Gospels. Even the enemies were saying he's doing things that we can't fully understand, but they attribute a different source. They say it's not God, it's got to be the devil. But obviously, everyone is saying Jesus was doing some kind of surprising feat, some kind of miracles. So you have Jesus actually living, him being a teacher, him confirming his teaching by miracles, and then making disciples who are following after him. Now, notice another piece of historical evidence is that he actually died at the hands of Pilate. That's not just something the Gospels came up with. Jesus died at the hands of Pilate. That places us with an actual person in history, a Roman procurator, who put Jesus to death. But then notice that even after Jesus was put to death, he doesn't say anything about the resurrection. I acknowledge that. But he says that Jesus did die, and yet for some reason, thereafter, his disciples continued to love him, continued to be allied with him. That sounds an awful lot like the basic facts of the history of the Gospels. Take a look at Tacitus. He says, "Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus," I believe that to be the Latin spelling of the Greek word Christ, "from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Now you have a Roman who hates Christians, saying these Christians come from a guy named Christus, who died during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And then finally, we have Pliny the Younger saying this. In the early 2nd century, he's actually writing to the Roman emperor and saying, hey, I know we don't have any official policy about how to deal with these Christians, but here's what I'm doing. Is this acceptable to you? And here's what he writes. He says, I have asked them if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and third time with a warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. For whatever the nature of their admission, I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. They also declared that the sum total of their guilt or error amounted to no more than this: they had met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternately amongst themselves in honor of Christ as if to a god, and also to bind themselves by oath not for any criminal purpose, but to abstain from theft, robbery, and adultery. This made me decide it was all the more necessary to extract the truth by torture from 2 slave women. I found nothing but a degenerate sort of cult carried to extravagant lengths. Now, here is definitely a hostile source. He is killing Christians because they claim to be Christians. Now, why is this important to us? Because the Gospels tell us that Jesus came to make disciples. Disciples who would give their life entirely to Jesus, who would change from being sinners to being saints, and would remain loyal to Jesus no matter what. And the faithful Christians, Pliny actually talks about those who give up on the name of Christian. He lets them go, but he says these who hold fast, he says, here's what we are all about. We're about following Jesus and praising Jesus. Notice that from Pliny's point of view, they're praising Jesus as a God. So they believe he is God. And that they are living a moral life. No theft, no robbery, no adultery. It's the very thing that the Gospels were telling us Jesus came to do. And that it actually worked out so that in the 2nd century you have people living according to that message. So you have 3 sources outside of the Gospels who say Jesus lived. Jesus taught, Jesus did miracles, Jesus died at the hands of Pontius Pilate, and yet people believed he was raised and worthy of worship even now, and they changed their lives to model after him. This is not some story that was just made up. This is a story that is corroborated because it is early, because it is eyewitness, and because you have sources that are even against Christians who are verifying the facts of the gospel. And so that leads me to my conclusion that the hope of Christianity is established on convincing proofs of the Gospels. Now, I think we could go through and start talking about some of the very specific reasons. For instance, that Jesus gave prophecies that actually were fulfilled, that the resurrection is the ultimate proof that these eyewitnesses are telling the truth. And ultimately, that's where we're going to get to with John chapter 20, is that this is the convincing proof. And whether or not, wherever you are in your understanding of Christianity, you can't say that this is not a record of history. That there was not a Jesus, and that his disciples did not believe that he was raised from the dead. And he actually fulfilled everything that he claimed he was going to do. Look with me in John chapter 20. John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. John tells us this is the purpose of his gospel. He's saying, here is my eyewitness testimony. I'm telling you these signs so that you can believe. He says, therefore, many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Notice, John is not saying, I want you to believe in spite of evidence. He's not telling you, I want you to believe in something that there is no historical foundation for. He is saying, you're far enough removed that you may not be able to see. That's why he says to Thomas, blessed are those who will believe, but believe that have not seen. But he says, I've written everything down of what I have seen so that you can believe, and that believing you may have life in his name. And at the end of the gospel, we're not going to read it, but notice that John, along with those who were helping him write this gospel, it says that there are many other signs that Jesus did, but then it says if they were all written down, you wouldn't even be able to contain, the world wouldn't be able to contain everything that Jesus did. What that tells us is this is a very pointed, very specific history, written down by an eyewitness so that you can know what you need to know to become a Christian, so that you can be saved. You see, this story is not something that happened long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. This is a story that happened in real time, in a real place, with a real person who is inviting you to follow after him and walk that path all the way to the point that you can step into eternity with him. These Gospels are reliable biographies about Jesus. So the question then is, will you entrust yourself to him as Lord and God? Or will you face him on Judgment Day, not being in a right relationship with him? Now is the time to get right with the Lord. See, these Gospels are trustworthy, but they're pointing us to a trustworthy God. And if you are ready to trust him tonight, we're ready to help you do that. If we can help you in any way, come as we stand and as we sing.